Howdy everyone! For today's Jolly Lark, we're going to be checking out an interesting new paint product that just came across my radar. I think this has been around for a couple of years, but I have never played with it or really seen any reviews of it before, so I thought I would check it out. It looks neat. It's called a Dirty Down, is the brand, Rust Effects. It's a water-based paint-on rust effect that promises kind of an easy all-in-one solution for creating realistic rust effects on miniatures. So following the instructions, it says you just kind of paint on a layer. You can put it on thicker or thinner. You can thin it with water all over the area that you want to be rusty. So I've painted the miniature silver first. This is one of my characters from the Ruinous Hive army project I've kind of had percolating for a little while. And then you just let it dry. That's it. So we're going to set it down there, leave the camera running, and dramatically speed up the footage, and we're all going to sit here and you can watch paint dry with me, which in this case is actually kind of interesting because as you can see, as this paint is drying, it actually is creating some pretty interesting and different looking rust effects than you might otherwise get from a normal wash or a shade, and some more natural irregularities than you might get with a traditional paint. But here's the big asterisk. I don't know if you noticed on the label at the beginning of the video, it says it's semi-permanent. On the instructions, it says not to let it get wet and not to handle the surface too much. And that if you want to paint over it, you should put a light coat of a matte sealant on top. But I wanted to test that out and see what that really means. So I grabbed some Agrax Earthshade, which is often what I would put on top of rust. And as you can see here, the wetness of a shade paint, it's taking the rust effect right off of the surface. It's acting that Agrax Earthshade instead of shading it. It's acting like an eraser. It's just pulling that rust effect immediately off the surface. This is not working. So if I wanted to wash that with a shade, what I would really need to do is go in, let it fully dry, and then hit the entire miniature with a thin coat of a matte varnish, probably through some sort of spray, whether or not you're using an airbrush or a rattle can, spray can. I think that painting on a varnish over the dried rust effects would have a similar effect to painting on a wet paint, and you'd end up just stripping the rust effects right off of the surface. So this is a weird one. I thought it looked really cool when it was dry, but if you can't paint over it without sealing the miniature first, that's a little extra step that makes it not quite as quick and easy as I might have hoped. But I thought the rust effect looked really cool. And so you can see here, I'm going to go in, I'm going to put the rust effect on all the metal areas of this miniature, and we'll see what that looks like. The first bit was just a little test patch. Let's put it all over and we'll see what happens. And I'm going to try taking it out to the airbrush and giving it a quick coat of matte varnish. You can see it starting to dry in places, even as I'm working on the miniature. This stuff dries pretty fast. They warn you to put the cap back on when you're not using it so it doesn't evaporate. And as the title says, this stuff runs about $25 a bottle. This is by far my most expensive pot of paint I've ever bought. So we'll see if we feel like it's worth it. So back to watching paint dry. Your friends ask you what you did last night. You can say, I watched paint dry. But you can see here, it's really a cool effect, though. I'm so torn about this paint. It's expensive. It seems a little fiddly with not being able to paint over it. But man, look at that. That's a really cool rust effect with variations in oranges and browns and russet colors. You can still see some of the metal underneath. And that was super easy to paint that all over. But here's the rub. If you get this stuff wet at all, I mean, look at that. A damp brush, it's just stripping that rust right off the surface. So you're going to have to be careful how you use it. But here's another but. I had the idea. I was like, this is a little bit of a funky, like, reverse highlighting. Given how easily water pulls the rust effects off, I wonder if I could use a damp brush to actually kind of highlight the miniature and pull some of the steel that was underneath up onto the surface. So I decided to give that a shot. So my brush here, and as you can see, this is a terrible, old, crappy brush. is just barely damp. It is not dripping. I don't think I could dampen a tissue with this. It's just barely damp. I'm wiping it off on a paper towel before I'm doing this. This is not dripping wet. And this is the first time I've ever dry brushed a miniature without having any paint on the brush. But essentially what I'm doing here, and it's easier to see on the back, and look at that. That damp brush, it's like it's erasing the rust effect from the edges. So you're getting a similar effect to what you might get if you were dry brushing a miniature with silver, but instead you're kind of naturally removing the rust from the edges. I think this is a cool effect. This is really similar to the sort of effect you would get naturally on a rusty metal surface. So let's do a quick side by side. On the left, that's what it looked like after it dried. On the right is what it looks like after wiping away some of the rust. I like it. I think that's a cool effect. So to put this through its paces, took it downstairs and gave the whole thing an all-over spray with the Vallejo matte varnish through the airbrush. You could use a spray-on too. And what you can see here, spraying it with the airbrush, it really dulled down the colors. We lost some of the brighter oranges. I just kind of made the whole, I don't know, it made the whole rust effect a little less vibrant. It's still okay, but at this point, having put on the rust effect and then added another airbrushing step that I wouldn't otherwise do, I'm starting to question whether or not it's worth it based on the results I'm getting compared to doing a traditional silver paint, kind of a dark reddish brown wash layer, a bright orange layer. But let's keep trying a few more things and see what happens. So now that it's got a layer of matte varnish on it, the Agrax Earthshade isn't wiping away the paint anymore. It's working like you would expect it to. It's going into the cracks. It's not washing away the rust effect as strongly. So, score 1 for the directions. On the directions on the pot, it does say that a light coat of matte varnish will protect it if you want to paint on top. And it does seem to work. So that's an option. I do feel like putting on what really did feel like a pretty light coat of matte varnish dulled the colors enough that I'm not as happy with the colors after varnishing. But they're still kind of cool. But I wanted to see if I could kind of get some of that brightness back. So I mixed up a little bit of a bright orange paint mixed with a little bit of water to see if I could get some of the brightest orange highlights that were there on the rust effects previously. See if I could kind of put those back on the miniature. But, a lot of butts in this video, but isn't adding another step, At this point, it's paint it silver, use the rust effects, airbrush it, then get out another color of orange to add those bright orange highlights back in. And I'm still not 100% convinced that I'm not taking off a little bit of the rust effects with this watered down orange. This isn't a dramatic step. I like adding back in a little bit of the bright orange, especially in some of the little layers and pocks and stuff in the armor. I think it does help to kind of pop the shape of the armor a little bit more. I like this. You could skip this step. If I was committed to using these rust effects, I probably would take the time to put a little bit more orange on. One thing you can do in general when painting rust is to put on a watered down bright orange and then feather it out with a little bit of water like I'm doing here. You put a little spot, just a little dab of almost pure unwatered down paint, and then you kind of feather the edges a little bit. That can make for a nice naturalistic rust effect, whether or not you're using this dirty down rust effect, but that's true for any sort of rusty miniature. So, I don't know. I feel like adding the bright orange helps. I'm going to go back in and try to make the face of the miniature a little bit brighter still by going back in with some bright silver and going in with a quick dry brushing highlight step just to accentuate the model's mask. For a model like this that's metal head to toe, that's all metal, you want to make sure that you're not forgetting to draw the viewer's attention to the face. So I do want his face and his mask, which doesn't have any skin to draw your attention. Getting that just a little bit brighter will help. So at this point, if you're keeping score, we've got 5 steps. We've got paint it silver, use the dirty down rust effects, airbrush it with a matte varnish, add in a little bit more orange. I don't think the shading was necessary. And then as a final step, dry brush it with a bright silver. I'm happy with the effect. I like how the final miniature turned out. It's not quite as quick and easy as I hoped it might be, but if you did this as a final step and just put the rust over silver, I think that's a really cool effect, and it might be durable enough as long as you're handling your miniatures reasonably carefully. And you wear off a little bit, maybe that's okay if you've got silver underneath. So, $25 a bottle. I'll use up what I've got. I'm not sure that I will order more, but let me know what you think in the comments. I'm really curious to hear what people think of this product. So, thank you so much for watching today. We really appreciate all the new subscribers. Keep watching, and we'll see you next time.